Alright, so let's talk about a name we all know. Celsius, right? We see it on our weather apps, we hear it on the news pretty much every day. But the story of the man himself, Anders Celsius, I'm willing to bet it's one you haven't heard. We're talking about a super meticulous, kind of obsessive Swedish guy who started out chasing the northern lights and somehow ended up giving the entire world a common language for temperature. So, how on earth did an astronomer end up defining how we all talk about hot and cold? Well, let's dive in. It sounds like a trick question, doesn't it? I mean, what could those incredible shimmering lights in the sky possibly have to do with the number that tells you whether to grab a jacket in the morning? The answer, and this is wild, is a single person. One brilliant mind who was just as fascinated by cosmic light shows as he was by the cold. And yeah, you guessed it, that man is Anders Celsius. But here's the first big surprise. Celsius wasn't really a physicist, the kind of scientist you picture messing around with thermometers. Nope, he was an astronomer, first and foremost. His whole life was about the stars, the planets, and especially those mysterious northern lights. Way before we knew about things like the solar wind, Celsius noticed something really weird. Whenever there was a big aurora in the sky, his compass needle would go haywire. It would just deviate. Now, other people had seen this, but they usually just wrote it off as a mistake, not Celsius. To prove it, he got obsessive. He'd seal his compass in a container and make anyone who came into the room take off all their metal, keys, belt buckles, everything. And with that kind of precision, he showed a clear, undeniable link between the lights up there and the Earth's magnetic field down here. Okay, but to get to his most famous invention, you've got to understand the world he was living in. Just try to imagine a world where hot and cold were just feelings. They weren't objective facts. It was a world of complete guesswork. Today, temperature is a number. It's a fact. We just look at our phones. But back then, a doctor would literally just put a hand on your forehead to see if you had a fever. Was it a strong fever or a slight one? Who knows? You knew it was cold outside because, well, you felt cold. It was all totally subjective. Sure, thermometers existed, but they were more like scientific toys for rich guys like Isaac Newton. They weren't practical at all. Get this, there was something like 30 different competing scales, and none of them matched up. A thermometer was basically a novelty item, not a serious tool. It was just a thing you'd use to settle an argument with your spouse about whether it was time to turn up the heat. So how does a Swedish astronomer end up fixing this whole mess? It all kicked off with this huge scientific adventure, a trip to one of the most brutal places on Earth. And it was a journey that would make him painfully aware of the need for precision. Believe it or not, this was one of the biggest scientific questions of the day. Seriously, Isaac Newton predicted that because the Earth spins, it should be a little bit flattened at the poles, kind of like a pumpkin. But another famous group of astronomers, the Cassinis, had measurements that suggested the exact opposite, that it was stretched out, more like a lemon. The French Academy of Sciences decided they had to settle this debate once and for all. The plan was to measure the length of 1 degree of latitude near the equator and compare it to 1 degree measured way up north. And thanks to some pretty energetic convincing by Celsius himself, that northern expedition headed straight for Swedish Lapland with him as their lead astronomer. And let me tell you, the conditions were just awful. In the summer, they were practically eaten alive by mosquitoes in these massive swamps. Then in the winter, during that endless polar night, Celsius had to make these incredibly precise readings in the biting cold. And that's when he discovered his nightmare. His metal instruments were literally shrinking in the cold, which threw off all of his calculations. For a meticulous guy like him, this was maddening. That experience sparked an obsession. He had to find a way to measure and account for temperature, and to do that, he needed a thermometer that actually worked. And that frustration, born in the freezing Arctic dark, is what led to his greatest legacy. When he got back to Sweden and built his own fancy new observatory, he decided he was going to solve this thermometer problem for good. Just look at the mess he was dealing with. You had Fahrenheit, who set his 0 point at the absolute coldest he could get a saltwater mixture in his lab. Then there was Reaumur, who used 80 degrees for some reason. And the Delisle scale, which was popular in Russia, was basically backwards. It measured degrees of cold. It was total chaos. You couldn't compare anything. Celsius realized the key was using universal constants, reference points. Now, to be fair, he wasn't the first person to think of using the freezing and boiling points of water, but he was the first to prove, with his trademark obsessive experiments, that these points were incredibly consistent. He was freezing and boiling water from everywhere, wells, melted snow, at sea level, on hills, just to prove that the freezing point was a stable, reliable anchor you could use anywhere on the planet. And his solution was just beautiful. It was simple, it was elegant, and it was so perfectly in line with the thinking of the time. A base 10 system, 100 easy steps. It was logical, it was rational, and it was exactly what science needed. A simple, intuitive scale for the whole world. But here's the kicker. The scale that we all use today is not actually the one that Anders Celsius created. His original scale was completely inverted. No, I'm not kidding. He set 0 degrees for the boiling point of water and 100 for the freezing point. So on his original thermometer, a freezing day would read 100 degrees. And what we think of as a nice, pleasant 20-degree day would have been a scorching 80 on his scale. It was only after he died that his colleagues looked at it and said, you know what, let's just flip this thing around. And that's how we got the scale we use now. So he gave us the foundation for our modern temperature scale, even if he had it backwards at first. But to just remember him for the thermometer, that's to miss the full picture of a truly amazing scientist. This guy was a powerhouse. He was one of the first people to scientifically observe that all of Scandinavia was slowly rising out of the sea. He created this incredible catalog of the brightness of 300 stars using a totally genius method. He just counted how many identical glass plates it took to completely block out a star's light. He even wrote a best-selling math textbook and fought to get Sweden to adopt the modern calendar. The man was a machine. And what I think is really telling is how people described him back then. Not as some fiery, dramatic genius, but as this methodical, humble, and totally reliable person. He was patient and quiet, but absolutely stubborn when it came to getting the science right. In a way, his personality was a perfect match for his creation. Modest, precise, and indispensable. He really was a human thermometer. When you think about it, Celsius did so much more than invent a scale. He helped create a shared reality, a universal language that lets a scientist in one country perfectly understand data from a scientist on the other side of the world. His whole story is a reminder that so much progress comes from just creating common ground and agreeing on standards. Which kind of makes you wonder, right? What's next?